This prison is more than just walls. It's a fortress. A maximum security facility equipped with the most advanced surveillance systems in America. Cameras capture every move. Lights never go out, and no prisoner has ever dared to escape. But all of that is about to change. When a prisoner learns that he's going to be a father, desperation fuels his determination. He knows there's only one option: escape or die trying. Will he outsmart the unbreakable system, or will his dream of freedom crumble before his eyes? What follows is a daring prison escape filled with twists, betrayals, and unexpected turns. Stay tuned for the full story. Alton City Jail. At first glance, it could pass for a middle school tucked away in a quiet American suburb. But inside, the reality was far different. Built in 2002, this maximum security facility in Madison County, Illinois, was one of the most secure prisons ever constructed. Cameras covered every corner of the prison, from the hallways to the 9x12 cells, where inmates spent 23 hours a day locked away. Each cell had its own camera, leaving no place to hide. The lights never turned off. The guards checked on inmates every 30 minutes, and no one had ever dared to attempt an escape. But Quawntay Adams wasn't like other prisoners. Since he was 12, gang culture in Compton, California had already shaped his life. As a black man growing up in a world dominated by Crips and drug dealers, Quawntay saw his path in the streets. His only role models were the ones making money on the corner, and by 2004, he was hoping a $1.4 million marijuana deal would change everything. But the FBI had other plans. An undercover sting operation led to his arrest. Sentenced to 35 years, it seemed like Quawntay's fate was sealed. But that was the thing about Quawntay Adams. He never played by the rules of fate. From the moment he arrived at Alton, Quawntay's mind was already working. He wasn't just an inmate. He was a strategist, always observing, always thinking. As he sat in his cell, he realized that his motivation for escaping went beyond his own survival. It was about his unborn child, the baby he had learned about on the night of his arrest. He wanted to break the cycle of gang life, to give his child a future that didn't involve jail cells and locked doors. And in Alton, as the cameras watched his every move, Quawntay began his careful observation of every detail around him. The layout, the guards, and the steel walls that surrounded him. Alton Jail was a fortress. No one had ever attempted an escape, and no one thought it was possible. The prison's state-of-the-art security system kept everyone in line. But Quawntay wasn't just anyone. One night, while lying in his cell, he caught the scent of rain drifting through the exhaust vent. That small breeze told him everything he needed to know. The vent led outside, and if he could find a way to reach that vent, he might just make it out of this fortress alive. But the problem was that the vent was up in the ceiling, and the walls were fortified with steel, and the cameras left no room for error as it captures all angles not only in the room, but throughout the entire prison. Still, Quawntay had one advantage. He noticed a 12-inch blind spot just behind the camera in his cell. It wasn't much, but it was enough. From this tiny area, Quawntay started planning his escape. First, he realized that he would need a hacksaw blade to cut through the steel ceiling, but tools like that didn't exist in Alton. So he came up with a plan. He sent a coded message to his cousin, hidden behind a postage stamp, asking for the blade to be smuggled inside a hardback book. The book was delivered to another inmate, who passed it to Quawntay. Hidden inside the book's cover was the tool that would be the key to his freedom. But nothing at Alton was simple. Packages arriving at the prison were scanned using the latest technology. Any sign of tampering would set off alarms, and if the book was detected, Quawntay's plan would fall apart. He watched from his cell as the guards handed the book to the inmate, holding his breath, hoping that everything had gone unnoticed. Fortunately, the book was not examined and the blade had made it in. With the hacksaw blade in his possession, Quawntay Adams knew that his bid for freedom had officially begun. But in Alton City Jail, where security was airtight and bed checks happened every 30 minutes. Time was not on his side. Quawntay needed more than just a tool. He needed a strategy. He'd have to use the prison's own high-tech security system against itself. So knowing that every door was secured by loud buzzing alarms, Quawntay learned to listen. He memorized the footsteps of each guard, the length of their stride, the rhythm of their patrols. The buzzing doors gave him an early warning system, but he needed more. And so, night after night, he would scrape at the stainless steel ceiling, removing a fraction of an inch at a time, always alert to the sounds around him. 60 seconds of sawing, then pacing. Another 30 seconds, then pausing. It was a game of patience and nerves. Weeks passed, and Quawntay's plan was taking shape. But as the cracks in the ceiling grew larger, they became easier to spot. He had to improvise. With bars of soap and clear toothpaste, he became a chemist, carefully mixing the spackling paste that matched the color of the ceiling to conceal the damage. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he faced inspection as the guards entered his cell for bed checks. The cut in the ceiling, just inches from discovery, turned every moment into a terrifying game of hide and seek. 6 weeks after smuggling in the hacksaw, Quawntay had nearly completed his escape. He cut an oval in the ceiling, the size of a basketball, just big enough to crawl through. It was the moment he had dreamed about, the moment he had visualized every day since arriving at Alton. But as he made the final cut, he faced a new problem. The ceiling plate wasn't held in place. He couldn't just put it back. It would fall through if anyone touched it. As he tried to slide it aside, he heard the dreaded sound, the buzzer. Bed check. And the guard he feared the most, Mike Morelli, was heading straight for his cell. Morelli was the toughest guard in the prison, known for catching even the smallest slip-ups. If Quawntay was caught now, his dream of escape would vanish forever. He quickly maneuvered the ceiling plate into place and ran to the door to block the guard's view. The second buzzer sounded. He could hear Morelli's heavy footsteps approaching, seconds away from a confrontation that would seal his fate. The plan was going smoothly, until disaster struck. As he attempted to put the ceiling plate back into place, it slipped. And just as the plate fell, the guard he feared most, Mike Morelli, arrived for his second bed check. Face to face with his nemesis, Quawntay stood in front of the cell window, his heart racing. "What was that noise?" Morelli asked. Quawntay, quick on his feet, replied, "I'm just working out," trying to mask the tension in his voice. For a moment, Morelli stared, suspicious. The silence stretched on, the weight of the moment crushing down on Quawntay. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Morelli walked off. He was spared, but the relief was short-lived. Quawntay now had a new problem. The ceiling plate. It couldn't be placed back without falling again. He needed a solution. Using his jail commissary, Quawntay ordered peppermint candies and soaked them in water for days until they became gooey and sticky. He lined the edges of the ceiling plate with the candy mixture, forming a makeshift adhesive that, when dried, held the plate firmly in place. His plan was back on track, but the true test was still to come. Now, with the ceiling secure, it was time for the moment of truth. Quawntay disappeared into the blind spot of his cell's camera and hoisted himself into the hole. But when he lifted his head into the crawl space, his heart sank. It was pitch black, and he was boxed in. His weeks of sawing had led him into a dead end. But Quawntay wasn't a man to give up easily. Frustration mounting, he felt around in the dark until his foot jammed against a piece of metal. Out of anger, he yanked at it, bending and twisting until it broke loose. And then, in the darkness, he started hitting the metal, debris falling with each strike. Suddenly, a small beam of light pierced the void. He hit again. More debris, more light. Finally, he stuck his head through a hole. And there it was, the vent he had been looking for. The faint glow of streetlights outside shone through. After months of careful planning, he had found his way out. It was like discovering the Holy Grail. But then he knew he couldn't make his escape alone. He needed someone on the outside, someone who could help him from beyond the prison walls. That's when Tanya Goodwin came into the picture. Initially, she was just a pen pal, a distant connection. But as their letters turned into phone calls, something deeper began to form, a connection Quawntay could use. For Tanya, it started innocently. She had fallen for the man behind the bars, the soft-spoken, intelligent man who seemed trapped in circumstances beyond his control. When she heard his voice for the first time, she was drawn in by his charm. And soon, Tanya found herself becoming more involved in his life. What began as a friendship quickly deepened into something more. Tanya visited Quawntay in prison, and it wasn't long before she became smitten. Every conversation felt like a step deeper into Quawntay's world, and soon she couldn't imagine life without him. But Quawntay had more in mind than just companionship. He began asking questions about the layout of the jail, the cameras, the doors. Casual questions that seemed innocent enough at first, but had a far greater purpose. She became his eyes on the outside, provided him with key information about the prison's weak points, where the cameras were positioned, how the guards operated, and where potential exits could be found. What Tanya didn't know was that she was being used, her emotions manipulated by a man who saw her as just another piece of his carefully crafted escape puzzle. And for Quawntay, every piece had to fit perfectly if he was going to make it out alive. On their next visit, Quawntay's secret messaging system came into play. He handed her a note hidden behind a postage stamp, detailing where she should pick him up and how she'd be contacted. But to Tanya, it was more than just an innocent note. She was being pulled deeper into the plan without even knowing it. Quawntay spun her a story, telling her he was being released and needed a ride. Tanya didn't stand a chance. Quawntay's charm was like a spell. His words made her feel needed, important. She couldn't wait to get him out of jail and start a new life together. But as meticulous as Quawntay's plan was, one uncertainty lingered. Would Tanya show up when it mattered most? He couldn't shake the doubt. His whole future was in the hands of a woman he barely knew. And as his escape drew closer, that uncertainty gnawed at him. Still, freedom had never felt so close. As he stared out of the vent, looking at the world beyond Alton, Quawntay's thoughts shifted to the daughter he had never met. "I'm finally going to see her," he told himself. For days, Quawntay cut through the vent, slowly working toward his goal. He knew the final challenge was a 30-foot drop from the vent to the ground. A fall like that could end his escape before it began, so he devised a plan. He tore his prison blanket into strips, tying them together to make a rope long enough to lower himself down safely. Everything was set. But just hours before his escape, a problem arose. Mike Morelli, the guard he feared the most, was on duty. Ironically, Quawntay had promised himself he'd never attempt the escape while Morelli was working. The man was sharp, and nothing ever got past him. That night, as Morelli walked by and noticed Quawntay standing, he asked, "What are you doing up so late?" With a wry smile, Quawntay responded, "I'm waiting to go home." Morelli smirked and said, "Good luck with that," and he walked away. The moment had arrived, but before he could make his move, Quawntay needed one last distraction. Enter his unwitting collaborator, Sammy the bully, an inmate who loved causing trouble. Quawntay had recruited Sammy to create a distraction at the perfect moment, shifting the guard's focus away from his cell. When the time came, Quawntay blocked the camera, slipped his dummy into bed, and changed into his prison-issued thermals. His heart pounded as he squeezed into the ceiling, making his way toward the light at the end of the tunnel. Everything was going according to plan. From the shadows, he spotted Tanya's car parked nearby. His excitement surged. Freedom was within reach. But then, disaster nearly struck. Bright lights suddenly beamed into his face. A truck drove by, its headlights illuminating the vent. Quawntay froze, hiding in the shadows, praying it was just a false alarm. The truck passed. It was time. With the makeshift rope in hand, Quawntay slid down, burning the palms of his hands until he couldn't grip any longer. At 8 feet from the ground, he let go and dropped. Pain shot through his legs, but he was free. He sprinted toward Tanya's car, heart racing, expecting to hear shouts or gunfire at any second. As he reached the car, he realized it was her. But in a twist that could undo everything, Tanya hesitated. As Quawntay reached for the door, she locked it. His mind raced. Was she about to betray him? He begged her to let him in, watching as she started to slowly pull away. The look on his face, pure desperation, was too much for her to ignore. Reluctantly, she unlocked the door and let him in. Freedom, at last. But now, Quawntay had to rely on this woman he barely knew, and as they crossed the bridge into misery, Quawntay began to think of what lay ahead, seeing his daughter, starting a new life. But as they stopped at an ATM to get cash, a new doubt began to form in his mind. Could Tanya really be trusted, or had he just handed his future over to a woman who was about to show her true colors? Has Quawntay Adams made a fatal mistake in trusting Tanya Goodwin? After he scaled down the wall of Alton Jail with a makeshift rope of shredded blankets, freedom feels just within reach. But for Tanya, reality is sinking in. She realized now that she was an accomplice in a full-scale prison break. And she's not the only one discovering what Quawntay's made. Early on May 2nd, a paper carrier noticed bedsheets hanging from a vent at Alton Jail. That's when the call came in. "We have a missing inmate," the jail superintendent said. The manhunt for Quawntay Adams was officially on. Local law enforcement sprang into action. Time was of the essence. They knew that every minute stretched the search area further. If he had been out for 15 minutes, they had a 30-mile radius to cover. If he'd been gone for 2 hours, that number exploded to 240 miles. Quawntay had been on the run for 2 hours, and everything was going according to plan. Instead of continuing to run away and stay as far away as possible, he preferred to settle in one of the small motels on the road. In the other end, investigators quickly pieced together logs showing that Quawntay had made several phone calls to a woman before his escape, Tanya Goodwin. Meanwhile, at the motel, Quawntay turned on the TV, and every news channel was broadcasting his breakout. The media frenzy was in full swing. Tanya, eager to stay with Quawntay, wanted to hide out with him in the motel, but Quawntay knew better. "If they find you with me, you'll be labeled an accomplice," he warned her. Thus Tanya took his advice and decided to go back home, but it was already too late. The cops were closing in, and by the time Tanya arrived home, officers were waiting for her, and under pressure, she cracked. She revealed his location, at a motel in Wentzville. For Quawntay, his worst fears were coming true. His trust in Tanya had backfired. The police raced to the motel. It was a race against time. Would his ride to freedom arrive first, or would it be a one-way ticket back to jail? Quawntay's heart raced as he heard the noise outside his room. The cops are here, he thought. And he was right. They kicked the door open, guns drawn, and found Quawntay lying in bed, clutching the sheets like a child hiding from a nightmare. But this nightmare was real, and in that moment, he knew it was over. His dreams of freedom vanished. Arrested and facing a 35-year sentence for his earlier marijuana charge and the attempted escape, Quawntay believed he was destined for a supermax prison, buried alive behind concrete walls. But the escape artist wasn't finished yet. Instead of finding more loopholes in the security, Quawntay found a loophole in the system. After being sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Victorville, California, he fired his legal team and began studying law from within the prison. He became his own defense attorney. On July 24, 2020, after serving 16 years of his 35-year sentence, Quawntay was finally released after a successful appeal. But his real journey began on the outside. The first thing Quawntay did was reunite with the daughter he had only dreamed of while locked away. The embrace of freedom was sweet, but it wasn't without its complications. After spending so long behind bars, Reintegrating into society was a challenge that few could truly understand. He had been in prison for his entire daughter's life. And now, as a free man, he had to build a relationship with her from the ground up. But Quawntay wasn't just focused on his own life. He had a vision, a mission to ensure that no other young person would walk the same road he had. Drawing on the pain of his past, Quawntay began working with community organizations, mentoring young men and women who were at risk of being swallowed up by the same system that had once trapped him. He shared his story, the highs, the lows, and the lessons learned, with anyone who would listen, determined to help others avoid the same mistakes. Quawntay's name began to spread beyond his community. He wrote a book about his life and experiences, turning his story into a testament of redemption. His charisma and intelligence, the same traits that had once made him a master manipulator, were now being used for good. He became a motivational speaker, a mentor, and a figure of inspiration for those who had lost hope. But his biggest win came when his life became the subject of a movie, cementing his journey from criminal to advocate on a larger stage.